everybody. Hi. What a great crowd. This is awesome for our last week of winter storytelling for 2025. It has been a great season, and I hope everybody has enjoyed it.
Let's hear it from Molly.
For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Molly Stockdale. I'm the Executive Director of Travelers Rest Connection. We are the nonprofit partner or friends group for Travelers Rest State Park. And we support the park through outreach, advocacy, and educational experiences connecting the past to the future. And I think today's experience is going to be one of those, looking at the history of smoke jumping. I want to start today's program by acknowledging that we are gathered today on the homeland of the Séliš people at a place they named Timsumkli. Their example as the original stewards of this land guides our work today. Travelers Rest Connection is committed to respectfully sharing the history and contemporary culture of the indigenous people who lived and traveled through the ancient crossroads on this land. We learn from many indigenous artists, elders, and organizations. We invite you to learn from and support them as well. A quick thanks to everyone who makes these programs possible, the members of Travelers Rest Connection, sponsors like Marsh McLennan, First Security Bank, Montana Public Radio, and MCAT, Missoula's Community Media Resource, which provided a media assistance grant to record this session. I want to thank the Travelers Rest staff for their hard work in setting all of this up, and a special shout out to Jess for baking this morning. We had an event last night, so she got up early today for you all. Okay, folks on Zoom. It is helpful if you keep yourself muted and your video off during the presentation. If you have questions for our speaker, please type them in the chat box. We'll monitor the chat for questions for any technical difficulties you might have. And I'm going to start with the question every week. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Any problems? Okay, Becca says no. I like it.
I have a question.
Question?
On Zoom, are you recording it so we can access later?
We are recording it on Zoom. MCAT is also recording it. When we have the professional video from MCAT, we will link it on our website, so you can watch it again and again, with Fred's permission.
We'll see how it goes.
And now to introduce, Fred Cooper was a smoke jumper during the fire seasons of '62 to '67 in Winthrop, Washington and Redmond, Oregon. Since retiring from a career in the Forest Service, he researched the history of smoke jumping and wrote a book, Smokejumper Experiment, with fellow smoke jumper and co-author Mike McMillan. Fred continues his passion for the history of smoke jumping and the U.S. Forest Service, serving as a board member of the National Smoke Jumper Association and of the National Museum of Forest Service History, which is building its Conservation Legacy Center here in Missoula. Shout out to our friends at the National, I have to read it every time, National Museum of Forest Service History. Fred's presentation today will be about the events leading up to the 1939 experiment, adjustments of original plans, and strokes of good luck during 58 jumps in the cool months of October and November in north central Washington. 16 men proved that parachuting into forest fires could be successful. Fred has brought some props and things or artifacts, I guess. I shouldn't say props. Artifacts to share with us today.
From the National Museum of Forest Service History.
On loan to us today from the National Museum of Forest Service History. Excellent. All right. Well, with that, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Fred Cooper.
So, thank you very much, Molly. And Molly didn't mention it here, but we are at the crossroads of where Lewis and Clark traveled in 1805, 1806, and I can't go without thanking them for making that trip. And what's the relevance to smoke jumping? About the only relevance I can bring is that when Lewis and Clark set out on a journey, they did a lot of planning. They had a mission in mind, which of course was to expand, and for President Jefferson, you know, explore the west of the Mississippi, and smoke jumping, you know, the purpose there was to get to fires small when they're small and try and get them out before they get large. You know, that's the objectives. Oops, I got to get a little bit closer to my mouth. So what I'll do is I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what led up to, you know, the actual smoke jumping. It just didn't happen, you know, on somebody wanting to say, hey, oh, we're going to use some parachutes and some airplanes, and we're going to just jump into some fires and put them out. There were numerous trials and errors along the way, you know, even a few tragedies too. So what we'll do, let me get my clicker going here. Of course, the first thing we needed to have was a parachute, and the parachute came along before Lewis and Clark made their trip here. In 1797, and the Wright brothers came along. They had to have an airplane too. In 1903, and Smokejumper quals. You know, in 1940, the qualifications were you had to be a firefighter, a young man, good physical shape, and we paid them $195 a month. And some of them even had to work on holidays too. Any extra pay. A little bit of use of airplanes and parachutes. The first use really of the airplane for aerial patrol was 1915, but not in the West, but in Wisconsin. They had a lot of lights there, and Curtiss Aircraft had a float plane that worked really good, and so they and it was free. You know, the old man Curtiss, said, "Hey, I'll do this for the state of forestry for nothing." And then World War I came along, and there was a lot of airplanes, and they became available after the war ended in 1919, and in 1919 and 20, the Army Air Corps provided the airplanes, but only for a couple of years, and funding ran out. They cut back. 1920s and 30s, the Forest Service said they did see the benefit of it, and they started renting some airplanes from local people who were hotshots and liked to have airplanes. And this lady I was talking to over here, she used to fly a Cessna 150. Well, there were people like that around the perimeters of forests with airplanes, and they could pick up a buck or two, and they'd fly air patrol for the Forest Service and do some cargo dropping, and later on they even got into some aerial photography and also emergency landing fields. There was, here in Missoula, there was a really hotshot guy, Howard Flint was his name, and we'll talk a little bit later. He said, hey, we need to get some airstrips back in the backcountry. So he would hand out a leaflet to the district rangers and say, here's what we need to have to get some airstrips out here so we can fly in crews and equipment, closer to the fires. People don't have to pack in all that stuff. So a lot of emergency airfields were set up, especially in western Montana and area. The first aerial fire patrols, this one, whoops, I gotta get the right clicker. You get too far here. I gotta get here on the air patrol, these were the flying coffins, they call them, from World War I. And it would take, for one pilot, it would take 3 mechanics to keep that cotton-picking airplane flying. And we're in Montana, western Montana, northern Idaho. There was this guy, Howard Flint, and he was instrumental in getting, like I said, the airstrips, but he also was a real proponent of cargo dropping. He had a few incidences too. There were a couple of times when they had him and his pilot crashed, but they survived. But before, and also, they had some barnstorming or daredevil, smoke jump or not smoke jumpers then, but jumpers, and they would pass the hat at county fairs and rodeos. And collect five, maybe if they could, maybe $10, and they not only would get the $10, a little bit of cash, but they also got a free airplane ride up in the air, and so they could jump. Well, those were the precursors to smoke jumping. Having these stunt pilots, or not pilots, jumpers. And here, they'd even, this is a situation here where in southern Idaho, they would even charge somebody $5 and take them up in the airplane, and they'd spend 15 minutes teaching them how to jump. They put this parachute on them and say, hey, you put it on 5 minutes, all you have to do is pull that red handle. Just don't forget to pull that red handle when you get out of the airplane. But it was an easy $5 or $10. And there were quite a few women that did it, so we had quite a few women jumpers at that time. Well, we still had to get the fires out, and there was a real hotshot fire officer down in Ogden, Utah. And he thought, hey, we've got to find a way to get to these fires fast and put them out. So he thought of the idea of a hot air balloon. And he fired off a letter to Goodyear Zeppelin Corporation in Ohio. And he got some responses back from them and said, yeah, we can do that. We just need to, you can fly very slow, you can remain stable over a spot to land, but there are a few disadvantages to this big hot air balloon. The load limit is 1,300 pounds at sea level. But we're in a mountainous area here. They need a ground crew of 12 to 15 men, at least 1,200 feet for landing. And the price tag was the stinger. It was $75,000 back in 1932 for a hot air balloon. Well, so that obviously was not, didn't work. So then, but this same fire officer in Ogden, he didn't give up on the hot air balloon method of trying to get people to fires. So he devised this method of using parachutes to drop jumpers to a fire. Well, his system was to and they did some experiments, and he recruited one of these barnstormer jumpers that jumped at rodeos and fairs, and by the name of Buddy, forget his last name right now, but he talked him into it, And they tried the system. They made 28 drops, 24 of them with what they call a dummy parachute. They would use about the drop under a parachute, about the weight of a person. And they would drop this weight and the parachute, and it worked, it always opened just fine. And their system for dropping the jumper was the pilot would make the decision, and the pilot would be flying along, and they altered the airplane so there was a hole in the bottom of the airplane. This was a travel airplane. I'll show you a picture later of that type of an airplane. And the hole, and then they would put a ladder, short ladder, down the bottom of the airplane, and the jumper would sit there in a chair type of arrangement, and the pilot, when the pilot would get to where the jumper should be landing, he would pull a lever, and the chair would be pulled out from under the jumper, and he would land. Now that's not too bad. They did this twice over the Ogden Airport, just for a test. And when they did this, they did it, for anywhere from about 100 to 400 feet off the ground. So the pilot is flying along. This is a good spot. We pulls the lever, and the chair comes out from underneath the jumper, and it goes down, and the parachute automatically opens. It's a 28-foot parachute. It's a little bit small, but it works. It works, and but the FAA was watching them at the airport, and the FAA said, "Hey, before you do any more testing, you got to get our approval." And so this fire control officer, and also this, the jumper, he got involved, and they sent telegrams to even back to Washington D.C. saying, "Hey, this is a great system. It will work. The pilot, can easily find a spot near a fire, open area, and drop the jumper." But there was no, the folks in D.C., said no. And one of the responses was, here's all parachute jumpers are more or less crazy, just a little bit unbalanced. A famous quote from the regional forester here in Missoula, Montana. Now I take offense at this sometimes, especially about this statement here. But if you read that in context with just what I described to you, you can understand why jumpers are a little bit unbalanced. Well, the Soviets, Russian Smokejumper program. There was a forester in Russia, east of Moscow, maybe about, I've been near as I can figure, maybe 300-400 miles. And they were, of course, having problems with fire, their forests burning up just like we are, or were and still are. So this forester convinced his higher-ups, to give it a try. And lo and behold, he had the program started in '34, and they made first jump in '36. He took some training in jumping from some professional, parachutists in Russia, and and he got approval. It took him a couple of years, but he got approval to use parachutes and jumpers to jump into fires in Russia. And so they were the first ones really to use jumpers to jump into for fires. But the type of jumping they did was to jump into a farmer's field near a village, an open area, and gather up the folks from the commune or community in Russia, and then they would march them off to the fire. Well, that was a pretty good idea, except there was a lot of pushback from the farmers because they didn't want to interrupt their growing season or harvest time to go out and fight a forest fire. So they finally, in Russia, they finally did do some jumping, but it was mostly in flat, open area. It really wasn't into, forested area. And also, it was the first woman jumper was a Russian in 1936. Yep. Well, here in the Forest Service, we were still wanting to figure out how we can get to fires when they're still young, small, without them getting too big before we have to send in a whole bunch of troops, to train them or to control them. I get a drink of water.
Here, I can. I won't pat that on this microphone.
You can talk.
Well, actually, I was just having a little side convo over there with Mandy about that the Russians had a female smoke jumper in 1936, and it was probably 40 or 50 years before the United States had a female smoke jumper. I don't know if we're going to get there, but just another one of those little tidbits.
It was actually, I think, 1981 for the first female smoke jumper. Yes, 1981. Is that right, Jeff?
That's correct.
Well, before they even thought about here in the United States of using parachutists to jump into fires, they had a project called firebombing. In 1936 to 1939, really it was about 37, 38, that they experimented with this in California. And it was, they would use an airplane with 5-gallon buckets of water underneath the airplane, and the pilot would get close to the fire. He would pull a lever, and the water would drop. That was one test system they used. Other test systems were for like a cargo. Somebody riding along would push the water out of the side of the cargo door of the airplane, and also they would even use explosives. They would some type of a small explosive device, throw it out over the fire to try and put the fire out. And there was some flame retardant material they would use that there were at the time for putting out petroleum fires. And so they could use material like that. And they even the Forest Service bought their first airplane. And it was called a flying fire engine. And it was painted green when it came out of the factory in Michigan. And the firebombing failed. Especially the water, bucket of water would drop. In California, on the harder ground, it would tend to, explode and open, but it wouldn't, getting it close to the fire was difficult. And a little bit the water they could drop or flame retardant material. It was, I won't say what it was like. And, but it failed, and the guy in charge of the program was this guy, David Godwin. He was kind of the fire program at the time. He was probably the Thomas Jefferson of the Lewis and Clark expedition. He was the man in charge. He had the money, and he had worked for the Forest Service prior to 1919 for about 15 years, and he quit and came back to work in 1936 for the Forest Service, and with a lot of business experience. But the plane and pilot, it didn't work in California, so they moved to Portland, Oregon, and they tried it again in some clear-cut areas where they were having problems with fires around Portland. And if you're familiar with it, it's on the Mount Hood National Forest or the Gifford Pinchot National Forest and over the river. And it failed there too. So somebody came up with the idea. Actually, it was the pilot and another guy in Portland, Oregon, decided to try parachuting men fires. Wow. But, they were going to give it a try. And so they went, they gathered up some people to put together a experiment. And so during the months of, during the summer, they did some planning, and there was a guy chosen to do it who had quite a bit of aerial experience. He was an aerial, he was a photographer, really. He would walk to and take mules to mountaintops around Oregon and Washington, take pictures, and then he would take those pictures back in the winter and draw maps. And he was he became very familiar with Oregon and Washington and the terrain, and he also had managerial experience. He was a forest supervisor up on the Mount Baker National Forest in Washington, and he was an immigrant from Sweden. So they did the planning July, September, and said, okay, we're gonna give it a try, and they let out a contract for some parachutes. First of all, they tried to borrow some parachutes from the military, and the military at the time was gearing up for World War II, and the military said, hey, we don't have don't have any parachutes available. So they let out a bid for some equipment, and a guy from, of all places, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the Eagle Parachute Corporation, said, hey, you're interested. I'll even come out to Portland and show you how my equipment will work. And he did that, and he convinced the officials in Portland, and they accepted the contract, and they ended up with, and the guy provided 2 professional jumpers. He provided some parachutes, and he also provided a protective jumpsuit. And the Forest Service provided 2 local jumpers, 2 local fire guards who later became jumpers in the experiment. And there were 2, I call it experienced jumpers, and I'll explain how they came on board. And then they had some 10 others. There were some tree climbers and some Forest Service officials. this is a little bit busy chart, but I just want to hit some high points here. Change hands here, maybe. My right hand on the clicker work better. They started out with dropping some shoots and trees, some silk parachutes. They wanted to know, well, how durable are they going to be? Well, on his first jump, Frank Gehry, who was the technical expert hired by the Eagle Parachute Company, injured his back, and he was laid up for 2 weeks. And the other person that was hired by the Eagle Parachute Company to do work on the job was a guy named Glenn Smith. He strained his knee on his second jump one day, jumping into trees for the first time. It was the first time there was ever a premeditated parachute jump into trees in the United States. He ended up straining his knee on a line. One of the lines came under his knee, and he strained it, and he was unable to jump for the whole rest of the experiment. And also, when he was doing that, the guy, Loggy Wernstadt, was the guy I was talking about who was leading the project. He ran up to take a picture of Glenn Smith landing in the tree, and he had a stroke. And he was unable to participate anymore in the experiment, and the fire control officer on the Chelan National Forest, where this experiment occurred, took over the lead for the project. Well, with those people, 3 of them laid up, what are we going to do? We got to have some jumpers. Well, it so happened that Frank Gehry had 2 brothers. They were from Wenatchee, Washington, the Dairy brothers. And Virgil and Chet were brothers of Frank. And Frank called them up and said, hey, and Wenatchee was only less than probably 100 miles at the most from where they were doing this experiment. And Beach Gill, the president of the Eagle Parachute Corporation, paid him $500. They had done a little bit of stunt jumping, but that was about the extent of their experience. And but they came on board, and it was 2 days later, Virgil had some lacerations on his chin and cheek. And the parachute that they were using at that time was what they called an Eagle parachute, named after the company, and the protective headgear they used was something like this: an open cockpit pilots. It was not one of these. It was not one of these helmets. It was like this. Well, on one of his first jumps, he got a real bad laceration on his cheek, his chin, and when he was interviewed later at a reunion, a Smokejumper reunion, about 40 years later, in 1984, he said, I landed and I was like stuck like a pig, just bled like a pig. And in 1984, one of the guys that he had jumped with at this time was there, and they could still see the scar on his cheek and his chin from that laceration. Well, so and the jumpsuit, so that something had to be done in order to get this project to be of any semblances of being successful. So they had to have some different headgear. So what they did, this is a football helmet from the 1930s, and they took a catcher's mask and put a catcher's mask on it to protect the jumper's head. This was an actual, helmet that was used, in early 1940s by the Smokejumpers. And then the suit itself was it was a one-piece. The suit was a one-piece suit, and it was made of a heavy canvas, and it had a 1-inch foam in it, and it protected the body of the jumper, but it did not provide hardly any maneuverability for the jumper to, he had to be held into the plane in order to, be in a position to jump out, number one, and then number two, being able to get out back into the door or onto the strut of the airplane to fall was really, difficult. So they needed to do two things. They needed to do something about the suit, it had to be better, and also the headgear. So what happened is that David Godwin, the guy with the money, and Virgil Derry, who couldn't, he was laid up from the lacerations on his chin and cheek, they went to Seattle with a mock-up of a suit that would be best to be used. Frank Derry worked with a harness maker in Winthrop, Washington. It was in the town where they were doing the experiment, and they developed a mock-up suit material, a pattern, you might say, to be used for the jump, or for the suit. And they went to Seattle. Best I could figure is the pilot probably flew them over. It would have been about a 2-hour, at the most 3-hour flight from Winthrop, Washington, over to Seattle. And they'd lined up somebody over there, material to make a suit. And they made 2 suits. One of the suits is still, we know it's on display out at the Museum of Mountain Flying. It's a red suit, and the other suit was made of a green material, and it was of I think they called it a twill, T-W-I-L-L material. I don't know what that is. And while they were gone, there were 2 fire guards with experience who were employees of the Forest Service. Al Honey and Dick Tuttle. They started making jumps, and then a few days later, Virgil and David returned back from Seattle with the new suits, and news media was really hot on this. Wow, this is really good information. And there were two main media outlets that came to town and took pictures, and the media, the newsreel guys would set up their cameras on a stand, take pictures, and they'd give the jumpers, $4 or $5, or maybe even $10, to try and hit their camera setting on a tripod, or $10 for the guy who could land on the tallest tree. $10 is a lot of money for these guys. And also on the media, and then a lot of my research comes from newspaper articles as well as official documents. And there were newspaper articles. Somebody in this town of Winthrop, Washington, had been that winter back east in Ohio visiting family, and they went to a movie. And at the movie theater was a news story about Smokejumpers in Winthrop, Washington. And this lady was so excited to see the Winthrop, Washington on this newsreel. And for those of us that are old enough, went to movie theaters back in the 50s, we would have those newsreels show up before the primary show came on the screen. Who remembers that? Oh, wow, well, I discovered that landing in a tree was a problem. For the experiment, what they did is they had these tree climbers, and the tree climbers, their job was to, when a person landed in a tree, get up there and get them out. Well, that didn't make much sense later on. So they had to develop a procedure for getting for a jumper to get themselves out of the tree, because they couldn't always land in open areas. Jeff, how many times did you land in a tree?
Me personally? But some people quite a bit.
Out of my 42 jumps on fires, I probably had at least close to half of them in trees. I wasn't a very good getting to the ground. I won't go into it. I'll I've got some pictures later on here to talk about that a little bit more. And so they made a lot more jumps, ridges, trees, and tree climbers. At the end of the project, the tree climbers, Harry Tuttle and Francis Lufkin, made a jump at the airport. Harry Tuttle went on to be trained to be a jumper the next year, and then he was badly injured and wasn't able to jump anymore. But Francis Lufkin, he went on to a career as the base manager in Winthrop, Washington for many years. He probably until at least another 30-some years. And then the officials, they even made a jump. Here's the first jumpsuit. It was a one-piece suit. It did have a collar on it, and you can barely see the helmet up there. I'm not very steady here. And why in this picture the guy's carrying a rope, I don't know. And there's the Eagle parachute. What really led to the success of this program, I believe, is probably this Eagle parachute. When the stunt jumpers would land at rodeos or fairs, it was just a simple round parachute. And they would judge, by the wind, where they need to get out of the airplane, so they'd land in the middle of the rodeo grounds or fairgrounds, an open area. They just float down. Well, this Eagle parachute had on it, some tails, and it had on it, had a forward speed into it. So when the guy, jumped out, the parachute was always going forward, maybe 5 miles an hour. And by pulling the lines one way or the other, it would affect the tails, and the parachute would turn right or left. And if it had not been for that Eagle parachute, I believe it would have been it would have been another unsuccessful program. And this parachute had only been patented the year before, 1938. I've got one laying up here, and it has the patent on it. And I'll show a very short clip later on, toward the end here, of the Eagle parachute during this experiment. And there's the Eagle and the parachute, how it opened. There's a reserve on the front. It's huge. And the fire pack was just a simple canvas pack with a shovel, plastic in it, and some sea rations for a couple of days. And there's a picture of the new suit. You can see it had a jacket separate from the pants, and the pants zipped all the way up, the side. And you can see on this guy here, there's a belt to help the strain, and you had leggings to protect the ankles too. And they were called timber jumpers. Yeah, they were, jumping into timber. The word smoke jumpers didn't develop until to the end of this project. Somebody said, one of the guys on the project said, we have smoke chasers that walk out to the fires. Now we have smoke jumpers. That's how smoke jumpers, the word smoke jumpers came about. Then there's some examples of tree landings. And on this one here on the left, there's the Dick Tuttle, one of the fire guards, up the top landed in the snag. And that happens to be his dad, who was a tree climber, going up to get him. The two of them did a little bit of stunt jumping, later on. And the letdown, getting a letdown, it's a technical process, and I won't get into the details. But they had to develop a system, to get themselves. This is parachute, harness and parachute are all one piece. And when you do that, the jumper landed in a tree, they had to get themselves on-stamped and unhooked here in order to get down and out. And that just didn't work. So what happened is that, Frank Derry, the brains of this whole experiment, he cut the strap up here, and he had this harness manufacturer in Winthrop put in a snap, harness snap, and to be so that it would make it simple for you. The smoke jumper, all he had to do was unsnap the snap here, these two snaps, and he'd still have the harness on, but he could get himself down to the ground. I'm oversimplifying it there. There's just a picture of the first suit, second suit. That's Francis Bluffkin there, either just before or after that jump in 1939. But it was successful. They ended up with a one-piece suit, one-piece suit, to a two-piece suit, leg pocket for let down, added a place in the arm for a handle for a pocket for the knife. They had 58 jumps, no uncontrolled fears of hysteria, even with the ripcord being used. that did develop a real problem, you know, the following year, and they did develop a system so that they called it, so the parachute just automatically opened as the person left the airplane. It was pulled out of the bag. 12 of the 16 people made the jump, anywhere from, they were ages ranged from 22 to 47. And like I said, Smokejumpers was a coin, and they said, hey, the David Godwin, the guy with the money in Washington, D.C., told if this program is so successful, he ordered that Portland and Missoula develop a program for 1940. And the fire control officers for those two regions at the time were brothers. So they really got their heads together and developed a really good program. So in 1940, they did have a smoke jumping program in Washington and in Montana. And this guy here really was the brains of the outfit. And you can read more about that in my book. The book that Mike McMillan and I wrote. I really did the research and wrote a thesis, and it was pretty boring. And I ran across Mike, who was also a smoke jumper, and he's a journalism major in college. And he'd already written a book or two, so he and I partnered up, and he made my material readable, and then he also wrote an epilogue that involved what we call now the Ram Air parachute that's being used today. So 1940, the Forest Service got rid of the airplane in the winter after that experiment in January, February, March of 1940. World War II was really ramping up, and the federal government had to turn back and find all the money they could, turn back for the war effort, and so the airplane was sold, and Johnson Flying Service here in Missoula became a primary contractor for flying smoke jumpers for many, many years. And there were 5 jumpers in Winthrop. One, like I said, one was injured. And so they ended up with 4. Here in Missoula, there were 7 that were selected. One failed his medical here at Fort Missoula, and then he just couldn't. There was another one who just couldn't handle that red handle, pulling the ripcord. That was just, totally unnerving. And I was going to school at Oregon State. I could relate to that. I did 5 skydiving jumps, and it's fun to ride down once you got the canopy over you, but floating down as a skydiver is, not my cup of tea. And it was, for that season, the smoke jumper cost for it was $9,000, and if they figured they had used ground crews, it would have cost $30,000 to put those fires out that they fought. This is just a pilot's log book for that first jump in July 12, 1940. There's the airplane. This is the picture of the actual airplane just getting ready to take off for that first fire jump. And that's that same airplane restored. And one of the things that the smoke jumpers are proud of is that in 1940, there were some army men that came here to Missoula, and the training for 1940 for the smoke jumpers was over at Sealy Lake. And these
Army, Army airborne, not the airborne at the time, but Army officers came and Major William Lee from Fort Benning, Georgia, was one of the officers, and on June 26th. And July 12th was the first fire jump, and later that month was the Army Airborne Infantry Test Platoon was approved, and it wasn't until September of that year that they did 5 training jumps. So the Forest Service smoke jumpers jumped on fire before the Army had a test platoon jumping. So it's kind of something that the smoke jumpers were proud of. And this Major Lee, he later on went on to be the father of the American Airborne and preparing troops for invasion in June of 1944. But just before, a little bit of background there, just before he was making that that trip, he had a heart attack, and he wasn't able to personally, make that trip. So we've had 85 years since 1940. We've had a number of things going on. The Warriors, Operation, there's a Triple Nichols, Operation Firefly, some segregated Army troops in 1945 to combat the Japanese balloons, fire balloons and bombs coming over during World War II. We had to, we hardly could find anybody to fight fires or smoke jump during the war years, so they had recruited some conscientious objectors. Man Gulch had a lot of jumpers in the CIA, the first woman in 1981. We've had a tremendous amount of changes in parachuting equipment, different airplanes, over 6,000 smoke jumpers, Forest Service, BLM. There have been 32 who died from 1945 to 2021. And most of those were on the fire line, but there have been, I can't remember the exact number, but 3 or 4 who have died in the actual parachute jump themselves. Actually, the first one that did die was in a parachute jump, and it was one of these segregated Army troopers back in 1945. And if you want more information, the National Smoke Jumper Association has a website, just smokejumpers.com, and then Forest Service Museum, forestservicemuseum.org. With that, I've got a real short, less than a minute long video that I just discovered. Oh, this is really fantastic. Last week, it's Brianna McCabe, who is a producer for at Montana PBS, has done a lot. She last year or year before, she did the Higgins Ridge documentary. If anybody's seen that, and it's an excellent program. And I told her I wanted some footage from that, and then she showed me this one.
Oh.
You having problems?
Yeah, you might need to, did you turn the power off on your clicker?
Okay.
And sometimes it's on
I don't know what happened here.
Higgins Ridge.
There we go. All right, well, we're gonna try turn off, turn on again. That's the way we do things.
Been there, done that? Yeah, question what we're doing this.
Gibbon?
Do they ever jump out of helicopters?
Did they ever jump out of helicopters is the question. There have been what we call in the Forest Service heli-jumpers, but it's the type of jump where the helicopter pilot gets down low and hovers over, maybe only try to get down 4 or 5 feet, maybe 10 feet off the ground, and where the firefighter jumps off the rudder of the air helicopter to land on the ground.
So Fred, they did an experiment in Missoula, jumping out of helicopters, but they didn't do too much of it. One of the jumpers got hung up on the skid, so not good. So they stopped. But they didn't.
So there actually was, they did actually try some smoke jumpers jumping out of an airplane, or out of a helicopter, but got hung up. Stopped, not successful.
So, what were the parachutes? I know they went to, did they go to a different round parachute before they went to the, or what were the different parachutes?
You're still talking about the Ram air parachute?
Yeah, what was, well, you talked about a different one that they were using.
Well, it was the Eagle. This is the Eagle, and which we're going to be able to see a motion picture of here. And then they went to the Ram Air, which is more like a elongated wing, over it. That's the two main ones, but there have been a tremendous amount of other modifications that have been made. That's a.
Okay, we got it.
Okay, here we go. I'll keep my mouth shut, you can see here. This is actual 1939 footage by a citizen of Winthrop, Washington. So there you can see the tails, on this Eagle parachute, how it's maneuvering. And it has that built-in forward speed to it. There's a nice, soft, slow. And here's the airplane that was being used. That's it. Had to learn to cross. I guess Molly's got set up back here. If anybody wanted to, get the book that Mike and I wrote, you're welcome to it, and I'll sign it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Fred. Let's give him another hand. Are there any questions from our Zoom audience? Okay, thanks. I'm sure Fred's going to be around for a while, so if you have any more questions, please stop by the table out here. We will be selling books, and Fred will sign them for you as well, I believe. I just wanted to extend a special thank you to everybody for supporting winter storytelling this winter. It's been a lot of fun, and I think today I also want to offer up a thank you to the Forest Service. We've had so many speakers over the years from the Forest Service, and especially so many volunteers. And now I'm going to cry because one of our favorite, we lost this year, Tom Chenard's passed away. His wife Barbara's here today. I'm so happy to see you here. Those of you who knew Tom, the sculpture in the back of the room was made by him. It depicts Lewis and Clark as they departed Travelers Rest in 1806, and it is a very special addition to our visitor center here, and Tom was a very special addition to our lives, and I know to the Forest Service as well. So, just had to say that. Thank you again for being here. Come see us if you would like to buy one of Fred's books, and we will see you at another event soon. Watch your email for information. Bye-bye.